This June, Filthy Armenian Adventures invites you to Hive, a private investigation of the birds and the bees. An IRL evening of mystery, bromance, and buzz in search of the missing man. LA on June 14, Austin June 17, NYC June 21, and a date in London is in the works. Like all of our signature IRL adventures, this will be an unforgettable feast of sticky subjects and cross-pollination, featuring some of the sweetest and most brilliant minds in the world, including Jack Mason of the Perfume Nationalist in Austin, and at all stops, my oldest friend in the world, the illusionist and hypnotist, Garin Ovanessian. June 14 LA, June 17 Austin, June 21 NYC, and London pending. For tickets, DM on Patreon at patreon.com/filthyarmenian or email filthyarmeniantix@gmail.com. Hive. Be there. The world of the scripture stories is not satisfied with claiming to be a historically true reality. It insists that it is the only real world, is destined for autocracy. All other scenes, issues, and ordinances have no right to appear independently of it, and it is promised that all of them, the history of all mankind, will be given their due place within its frame, will be subordinated to it. The scripture stories do not, like Homer's, court our favor. They do not flatter us that they may please us and enchant us. They seek to subject us, and if we refuse to be subjected, we are rebels. Let no one object that this goes too far, that not the stories but the religious doctrine raises the claim to absolute authority. Because the stories are not, like Homer's, simply narrated reality. Doctrine and promise are incarnate in them and inseparable from them. For that very reason, they are fraught with background and mysterious, containing a second concealed meaning. In the story of Isaac, it is not only God's intervention at the beginning and the end, but even the factual and psychological elements which come between that are mysterious, merely touched upon, fraught with background. And therefore they require subtle investigation and interpretation. They demand them, since so much in the story is dark and incomplete, and since the reader knows that God is a hidden God, his effort to interpret it constantly finds something new to feed upon. Doctrine and the search for enlightenment are inextricably connected with the physical side of the narrative, the latter being more than simple reality. Indeed, they are in constant danger of losing their own reality, as very soon happened when interpretation reached such proportions that the real vanished. If the text of the biblical narrative, then, is so greatly in need of interpretation on the basis of its own content, its claim to absolute authority forces it still further in the same direction. Far from seeking, like Homer, merely to make us forget our own reality for a few hours, it seeks to overcome our reality. We are to fit our own life into its world, feel ourselves to be elements in its structure of universal history. This becomes increasingly difficult the further our historical environment is removed from that of the biblical books. And if these nevertheless maintain their claim to absolute authority, it is inevitable that they themselves be adapted through interpretive transformation. This was for a long time comparatively easy. As late as the European Middle Ages, it was possible to represent biblical events as ordinary phenomena of contemporary life, the methods of interpretation themselves forming the basis for such a treatment. But when, through too great a change in environment and through the awakening of a critical consciousness, this becomes impossible, the biblical claim to absolute authority is jeopardized. The method of interpretation is scorned and rejected. The biblical stories become ancient legends, and the doctrine they had contained, now dissevered from them, becomes a disembodied image. As a result of this claim to absolute authority, the method of interpretation spread to traditions other than the Jewish. The Homeric poems present a definite complex of events whose boundaries in space and time are clearly delimited. Before it, beside it, and after it, Other complexes of events which do not depend upon it can be conceived without conflict and without difficulty. The Old Testament, on the other hand, presents universal history. It begins with the beginning of time, with the creation of the world, and will end with the last days, the fulfilling of the covenant, with which the world will come to an end. Everything else that happens in the world can only be conceived as an element in this sequence. Into it, everything that is known about the world, or at least everything that touches upon the history of the Jews, must be fitted as an ingredient of the divine plan. And as this too became possible only by interpreting the new material as it poured in, the need for interpretation reaches out beyond the original Jewish Israelite realm of reality, for example, to Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, and Roman history. Interpretation in a determined direction becomes a general method of comprehending reality. The new and strange world which now comes into view, and which, in the form in which it presents itself, proves to be wholly unutilizable within the Jewish religious frame, must be so interpreted that it can find a place there. But this process nearly always reacts upon the frame, which requires enlarging and modifying. The most striking piece of interpretation of this sort occurred in the first century of the Christian era, in consequence of Paul's mission to the Gentiles. Paul and the Church Fathers reinterpreted the entire Jewish tradition as a succession of figures prognosticating the appearance of Christ, and assigned the Roman Empire its proper place in the divine plan of salvation. Thus, while on the one hand, the reality of the Old Testament presents itself as complete truth with a claim to sole authority, on the other hand, that very claim forces it to a constant interpretive change in its own content. For millennia, it undergoes an incessant and active development with the life of man in Europe. The claim of the Old Testament stories to represent universal history, their insistent relation, a relation constantly redefined by conflicts, to a single and hidden God, who yet shows himself and who guides universal history by promise and exaction, gives these stories an entirely different perspective from any the Homeric poems can possess. As a composition, the Old Testament is incomparably less unified than the Homeric poems. It is more obviously pieced together. But the various components all belong to one concept of universal history and its interpretation. If certain elements survived which did not immediately fit in, interpretation took care of them, and so the reader is at every moment aware of the universal religio-historical perspective which gives the individual stories their general meaning and purpose. The greater the separateness and horizontal disconnection of the stories and groups of stories in relation to one another, compared with the Iliad and the Odyssey, the stronger is their general vertical connection, which holds them all together and which is entirely lacking in Homer. Each of the great figures of the Old Testament, from Adam to the prophets, embodies a moment of this vertical connection. God chose and formed these men to the end of embodying his essence and will. Yet choice and formation do not coincide, for the latter proceeds gradually, historically, during the earthly life of him upon whom the choice has fallen. How the process is accomplished, what terrible trials such a formation inflicts, can be seen from our story of Abraham's sacrifice. Herein lies the reason why the great figures of the Old Testament are so much more fully developed, so much more fraught with their own biographical past, so much more distinct as individuals than are the Homeric heroes. Achilles and Odysseus are splendidly described in many well-ordered words. Epithets cling to them. Their emotions are constantly displayed in their words and deeds. But they have no development, and their life histories are clearly set forth once and for all. So little are the Homeric heroes presented as developing or having developed, that most of them, Nestor, Agamemnon, Achilles, appear to be of an age fixed from the very first. Even Odysseus, in whose case the long lapse of time and the many events which occurred offer so much opportunity for biographical development, shows almost nothing of it. Odysseus on his return is exactly the same as he was when he left Ithaca 2 decades earlier. But what a road, what a fate lie between the Jacob who cheated his father out of his blessing and the old man whose favorite son has been torn to pieces by a wild beast. Between David, the harp player, persecuted by his lord's jealousy, and the old king, surrounded by violent intrigues, whom Abishag and Shunammite warmed in his bed, and he knew her not. The old man, of whom we know how he has become what he is more of an individual than the young man. For it is only during the course of an eventful life that men are differentiated into full individuality. And it is this history of a personality which the Old Testament presents to us as the formation undergone by those whom God has chosen as examples. Fraught with their development, sometimes even aged to the very verge of dissolution, they show a distinct stamp of individuality entirely foreign to the Homeric heroes. Time can touch the latter only outwardly, and even that change is brought to our observation as little as possible, whereas the stern hand of God is ever upon the Old Testament figures. He has not only made them once and for all and chosen them, but he continues to work upon them, bends them and kneads them, and, without destroying them in essence, produces from them forms which their youth gave no grounds for anticipating. The objection that the biographical element of the Old Testament often springs from the combination of several legendary personages does not apply, for this combination is a part of the development of the text. And how much wider is the pendulum swing of their lives than that of the Homeric heroes? For they are bearers of the divine will, and yet they are fallible, subject to misfortune and humiliation. And in the midst of misfortune and in their humiliation, their acts and words reveal the transcendent majesty of God. There is hardly one of them who does not, like Adam, undergo the deepest humiliation, and hardly one who is not deemed worthy of God's personal intervention and personal inspiration. Humiliation and elevation go far deeper and far higher than in Homer, and they basically belong together. The poor beggar Odysseus is only masquerading, but Adam is really cast down, Jacob really a refugee, Joseph really in the pit, and then a slave to be bought and sold. But their greatness, rising out of humiliation, is almost superhuman and an image of God's greatness. The reader clearly feels how the extent of the pendulum's swing is connected with the intensity of the personal history. Precisely the most extreme circumstances in which we are immeasurably forsaken and in despair, or immeasurably joyous and exalted, give us, if we survive them, a personal stamp which is recognized as the product of a rich existence, a rich development. You are listening to Filthy Armenian Adventures.
The word is about, there's something evolving. Whatever may come, the world keeps revolving. They say the next big thing is here, that the revolution's near. But to me it seems quite clear that it's all just a little bit of history repeating. People shout, a new style is growing, but it don't know if it's coming or going. There is fashion, there is fact, some's good, feel the joy and sidestep the little bits of history repeating.
And like a kiss being blown, we're back in the air with our good friend Yeerk from London to discuss a work of just mind-blowing depth and sweep and excellence of the 20th century, Mimesis, The Representation of Reality in Western Literature by Erich Auerbach.
A real tome.
A real tome. It's a mighty tome. Just as a brief history of this work, which many consider the best work of literary scholarship and criticism in the 20th century, especially scholarship. Erich Auerbach was a German Jewish philologist. And a philology, if you don't know what philology means, are you comfortable giving the public a definition of philology as a study? Yeah, are you familiar with it at all?
I don't know if I am. I am comfortable.
Okay, well, I feel like I'll try my best. Pressure.
I mean, I feel like I know the meaning of the word by connotation, if that makes sense. Like I think of austere or fiery German kind of sort of I guess the connotation I think of, this isn't the definition, I want to be clear about that, but it's almost like a kind of a literary philosopher or a literary historian, if you will, but like kind of it's something that sort of preceded literary criticism or literary theory as we understand it today, and roughly it's sort of like a kind of study of language, But I mean, but it's from a period where the study of language implied a study of what we now think of as literature
and history. It's like history. This, my sense of it, and I'll read some quotations by the author about what his kind of view of it is. But my sense of it is that it's basically about the development of words and literature as a historical discipline, and like through the not just etymologically, like you might say, well, this word comes from the root of this and this root. That's not the point. That's part of the point, but that's just etymology. But like this is like, well, how did this word go from a biological concept to a sociological concept to a literary concept through who took it from here and brought it here, who took it from there and brought it here, and in the meantime, how did it expand the general cultural landscape? Because you think of a word he wrote. So one of his essays, not in this book, but one of his essays is about the history of the word passion. So it's called passio. That's the root, and he traces how passio, which begins as passive suffering. That's kind of that's what passio means, and that goes from there to travels to the concept of erotic passion, travels to what we think of as passion today. Many branches to the history to the kind of journey of that idea.
A multiplicity as
yes, and also just massive consequences too. You think about how much passion. It doesn't mean as much, I guess, right now as it used to, even 20 years ago. That word, I think, because we become such bloodless fucks. But like passion used to be passion was really especially in the romantic period, but it's like it stands for, people just identify as passionate. Just imagine, think about how many people identify as passionate and how much we identify passionate as a personality trait, and you just think like, oh, this just used to mean passive and given to suffering.
Yeah,
it's you have a different idea of humanity when a word like that develops through time. And so I think philology to a large degree a study of such histories. Let me read you.
Yeah. I
So you're
think
talking
that's
about
a much more elegant description than what I supplied.
Well, it's also fuzzy because, like as Joseph Epstein says, I'll read a few paragraphs. Joseph Epstein wrote a brilliant piece about this book years and years ago. That's when I first found out about this book, actually. And as he writes, Erich Auerbach was a philologist. Once a standard academic discipline, philology is no longer in currency, let alone in vogue. In its traditional form, philology dealt with the structure, the grammar, syntax, and semantics of language and its historical development. Structure is a big word here. Structure, it's a lot about structure, like the as we'll see when going through this book. Philology has always seemed a more continental than English or American enterprise. In America, scholars who, in an earlier era, might have taught philology, taught instead what became known as comparative literature. In time, comparative literature fizzled out, taken over by literary theorists who turned out to be not all that much interested in literature in any language. What distinguished philologists and comparativists was their polyglottism. They knew multiple languages, and an article of belief among them was that literary works can only be truly comprehended in the languages in which they were composed. If you read works in translation, you are, from the philological standpoint, a schmoozer, a potzer, a kibitzer, and fundamentally unserious. In the prologue to his recent musings on mortality, Victor Brombert, who for many years taught complet at Princeton, notes that in all cases I have discussed only authors whose works I have read in the original. And that's what Erich Auerbach does in Mimesis. He only covers, through his 3,000-year history of literature, he only covers directly languages that he knows, and he knows 8 of them, but that doesn't include Russian. So when, for example, the Russians come up, he says he cannot, despite how massively important Russian literature is to the story, he cannot deal with it directly. So he's only going to deal with it in its effects on other writers in the languages he's familiar with. So he knows 8 languages and everything. And there's a lot here that's not translated. This is a work that was written originally in German, and the only part, anything that has to do, like the excerpts that he covers in the beginning or in the middle of each chapter, the segments, those are translated. But then all the phrases and stuff that he refers to throughout, especially the French ones, are not translated. So you kind of have to look them up on your own if you don't know French or whatever, or Latin.
Yeah, there are huge chunks of Latin text and French text, and Spanish text, a bit of Italian, bit of Dante, kind of sprinkled throughout this, and I kind of ended up skipping over the large, but I have this very pointless habit of, even though I don't speak any of these languages, I force myself to kind of drag my eyes across the words and try and sound them out in my head. When it was full pages of kind of non-English text, I kind of I gave myself permission to skip.
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing, and Jack talks about this all the time. Anytime you have a massive work in your hands that seems too daunting to ever continue, just sort of run your eyes over the parts that you're kind of lost on, and eventually you will find yourself back on your feet. You don't have to read this book all in one sitting, all in one in a row. I found myself unable to put it down for long stretches of time because I just kept on. I was so riveted by so much of what he was saying. It didn't take very long before I was riveted yet again. You'll find very shortly your interest reawakened really fast, even if you're starting to glaze over. Everyone should have this book in their library. And I would recommend that you read the first 2 to 3 chapters. You'll read them very easily, and they're in a way they're the most important chapters. They kind of lay the groundwork. They kind of make the entire case of the book, which will be continued throughout until his final, I think, author is Virginia Woolf, that he talks about, To the Lighthouse. In those first few chapters, he traces the development of literary consciousness from Homer to the Old Testament to the New Testament. That transformation alone, from Homer to the Bible, kind of tells the entire story and immediately makes you realize that we, what world we are living in as human beings. You know what I mean?
The book is called Mimesis, and the sort of subtitle is, the representation. Is it the representation of reality?
Yeah, the representation of reality in Western
right?
literature. Yeah.
And so what this book kind of is the how to describe it, it's kind of like the tracing of kind of representation within literature, and the tracing of how these kind of literary techniques for like representing reality have evolved and developed over time in this like particular historical context that connects with, the prevailing social structure of a given period, all of this kind of stuff. But the means by which he's tracing it is also, on the most granular possible level of, this deep study of the, grammar and syntax of sentences, and how then these also connect to the, like literary standards of a given time, and how those standards are also then, intimately connected with, reifying a particular social structure, a particular class system or something. This is like an incredibly dense work. I mean, it's awesomely dense, and I think that density comes from both macroscopic and microscopic detail and the relations between those things. And it goes incredibly in depth, both in that kind of macro sense and, and just at the level of the sentence. I mean, the parts that I found most difficult to read, most kind of challenging, where, I could feel my eyes wandering, is when he is like, I mean, this partly is just my ignorance of grammatical terms, because I I sort of understand by instinct, rather than, noticing like formal rules of grammar being obeyed in sentences. But like when he's kind of breaking down the structure of a sentence, I noticed for many chapters he's using this word parataxis, which I had to look up.
Yeah.
Which I don't now. I've trapped myself into having to give a definition for it. But okay, I'm just going to quote the Google Dictionary definition, which is what I looked up before. But the placing of clauses or phrases one after another without words to indicate coordination or subordination. So he's like very interested in just like how almost like the atomic structure of a sentence creates meaning, and how these kind of small details of grammar create meaning, but how also that meaning is like bound to a particular historical moment. And it's really breathtaking. I mean, the overview of it, his erudition, and obviously his facility with languages is something that is kind of, it's hard to think of a person who could match it today,
Impossible to think of anyone who could match it today.
Yeah.
It's also, and I'm gonna, we're speaking in these like grand, we're so kind of in awe of this achievement, and I'm going to get more to the nitty gritty of what's happening and why it matters to the layperson listening right now, because it is ultimately a history of reality, and that's the part that really grabs you. This isn't just a study of musty old works and in an academic laboratory. This is an argument, like a direct argument about the importance of Western literature to how human we are, like in all the ways that we consider ourselves to be human. Here's how he puts it, as he describes what his own discipline is. This was in an essay he wrote called "Philology and World History," which I think is collected in a book of his, which you might be able to find. Time, History, and Literature, Selected Essays of Erich Auerbach. Anyway, in this essay, Philology and World History, he writes, the intellectual and spiritual history of the last several millennia is the history of the human race as it has achieved self-expression. It is with this history that philology concerns itself as a historical discipline. He goes on to say, the task of philology was to evaluate literature and language in such a way that it might contribute to that history, and thus, quote, and thus to realization of a unified vision of the human race in all its variety. He thought that world culture was in the process of becoming standardized after the war, and that therefore our history of the development of it was going to be lost, and our sense of it. And boy, was he right. So, like, there's an absolute. It's interesting because in one sense, he's talking about a unified vision of the human race, but his entire discipline is to understand the specific roots of development of that vision through national literatures. It's a case is being made that our flattening of the world, the globalization of the world, is erasing our understanding of how our consciousness developed. It wasn't always like this. People did not consider, as he clearly demonstrates over and over in this book, like the individual was not like a respected creature forever. It became the individual the individual human being did not matter basically until the Old and especially the New Testament. And that's something that I don't think it's very hard to kind of get across to people today, because we take it so for granted that everyone matters, and that when we speak of people, we speak of everyone. That did not exist but a few thousand years ago. And it did not exist basically before the Bible. Before the Bible, it was the only people who mattered were knights, kings, and queens. That's it. Those are the only people who were considered worthy of any history. All the histories are about them and no one else. There are references to peasants and other classes. They're strictly confined to like low farcical styles. They're not permitted.
In terms of their representation, there is a like rhetorical mode that it's appropriate to render them within, right? And that's one of the things that he's kind of tracing throughout all of these different chapters. So, for instance, the Shakespeare chapter, which is, I think it's a scene from Henry IV, and he's also examining the Merchant of Venice as well. He's like showing how Shakespeare is kind of mixing these, I guess you'd say, like high and low mimetic styles, right?
Yeah.
And they kind of vary from character to character, and you kind of get this like, he doesn't really provide this overarching structure. You have to kind of intuit it from the patterns that he's drawing your attention to over and over again. But you kind of have the sense of literary history as like, I guess every text is sort of somewhere on this kind of scale of representation. There was something else there? Oh yeah, I mean with regard to this sort of significance of Christianity and the New Testament as kind of creating the individual. This the Dante chapter is really, really good on that, because he's talking about the scene, I think it's in Hell, where Virgil is leading Dante. I can't remember which circle it is, but it's where he encounters these two kind of Italian historical figures. I think one of them is Cavalcante, is the father of the poet Cavalcante, who Pound later, I think, translated. And then there's another figure, I can't remember his name, but they both kind of rise up and begin talking to Dante, and they recognize Dante's Italian speech, and this provokes them to rise up. And he's writing about the significance of even though this is a kind of fantastic scenario, right? This isn't, you shouldn't you can't be misled by this like idea of reality, like the representation of reality here, because there can be like fantastic scenarios, but it's to do with like the texture of the writing and how what's being described is being described. And here the significant thing is this kind of like the way that representing a soul as a coherent personality that persists and has the same memories even after death, acts as a like a representation of a concept.
This is your
of the
host,
self
Alec,
in general.
interrupting because my brain was scattered when Yeerk said what he said, and I accidentally changed the subject and didn't dive deeply enough into the brilliant chapter on Dante in this book. If you drift at some point in this book, your attention will come roaring back when he writes about Dante toward the middle. It's a huge turning point, and it's some of his best work. And rather than screw it up myself, I'm just going to let Edward Said, who writes the introduction to this 50th anniversary edition I have, I'm just going to quote Edward Said about the Dante chapter. Auerbach's choice of Dante to represent the second seminal moment in Western literary history is made to seem breathtakingly appropriate. Read slowly and reflectively, Chapter 8 of Mimesis, Faronita and Cavalcante, is one of the great moments in modern critical literature, a masterly, almost vertiginous embodiment of Auerbach's own ideas about Dante, that the Divine Comedy synthesized the timeless and the historical because of Dante's genius, and that Dante's use of the demotic, or vulgar Italian language, in a sense enabled the creation of what we have come to call literature. I will not try to summarize Auerbach's analysis of a passage from the 10th canto of the Inferno in which Dante the pilgrim and his guide Virgil are accosted by two Florentines who knew Dante from Florence, but who are now committed to the Inferno, and whose internecine squabbles between the city's Guelph and Ghibelline factions carry on into the afterworld. Readers should experience this dazzling analysis for themselves. Auerbach notes that the 70 lines he focuses on are incredibly packed, containing no less than 4 separate scenes, as well as more varied material than any other so far discussed in Mimesis. What particularly compels the reader is that Dante's Italian in the poem is, as Auerbach puts it assertively, quote, a well-nigh incomprehensible miracle, used by the poet to, quote, discover the world anew. There is, first of all, its combination of, quote, sublimity and triviality, which, measured by the standards of antiquity, is monstrous. Then there is its immense forcefulness, its, quote, repulsive and often disgusting greatness, according to Goethe, whereby the poet uses the vernacular to represent, quote, the antagonism of the two traditions, that of antiquity and that of the Christian era. Dante's powerful temperament, which is conscious of both because its aspiration toward the tradition of antiquity does not imply for it the possibility of abandoning the other. Nowhere does mingling of styles come so close to violation of all style. Then there is its abundance of material and styles, all of it treated in what Dante claimed was, quote, the common everyday language of the people, which allowed a realism that brought forth descriptions of the classical, the biblical, and everyday worlds, quote, not displayed within a single action, but instead an abundance of actions in the most diverse tonalities which follow one another in quick succession. And finally, Dante manages to achieve through his style a combination of past, present, and future, since the two Florentine men who rise out of their flaming tombs to accost Dante so peremptorily are in fact dead, but seem to live on somehow in what Hegel called a changeless existence, remarkably devoid neither of history nor of memory and facticity. Having been judged for their sins and placed inside their burning encasement inside the kingdom of the damned, Farinata and Cavalcante are seen by us at a moment when we have, quote, left the earthly sphere behind. We are in an eternal place, and yet we encounter concrete appearance and concrete occurrence there. This differs from what appears and occurs on earth, yet it is evidently connected with it in a necessary and strictly determined relation. The result is a tremendous concentration in Dante's style and vision. We behold an intensified image of the essence of their being, fixed for all eternity in gigantic dimensions. Behold it in a purity and distinctness which could never for one moment have been possible during their lives on earth. What fascinates Auerbach is the mounting tension within Dante's poem, as eternally condemned sinners press their cases and aspire to the realization of their ambitions, even as they remain fixed in the place assigned to them by divine judgment. Hence the sense of futility and sublimity exuded simultaneously by the Inferno's earthly historicity, which is always pointed in the end toward the white rose of the Paradiso. So then, quote, the beyond is eternal and yet phenomenal. It is changeless and of all time and yet full of history. For Auerbach, therefore, Dante's great poem exemplifies the figural approach, the past realized in the present prefiguring as well as acting like a sort of eternal redemption, the whole thing witnessed by Dante the Pilgrim, whose artistic genius compresses human drama into an aspect of the divine. The refinement of Auerbach's own writing about Dante is truly exhilarating to read, not just because of his complex, paradox-filled insights, but as he nears the end of the chapter, because of their Nietzschean audacity, often venturing toward the unsayable and the inexpressible, beyond normal or for that matter, even divinely set limits. Having established the systematic nature of Dante's universe, framed by Aquinas' theocratic cosmology, Auerbach offers the thought that for all of its investment in the eternal and immutable, the Divine Comedy is even more successful in representing reality as basically human. In that vast work of art, quote, the image of man eclipses the image of God. And despite Dante's Christian conviction that the world is made coherent by a systematic universal order, quote, the indestructibility of the whole historical and individual man turns against that order, makes it subservient to its own purposes, and obscures it. Auerbach's great predecessor, Vico, had flirted with the idea that the human mind creates the divine, not the other way around, but living under the church's umbrella in 18th century Naples, Vico wrapped his defined proposition in all sorts of formulae that seemed to preserve history for divine providence and not for human creativity and ingenuity. Auerbach's choice of Dante for advancing the radically humanistic thesis carefully works through the great poet's Catholic ontology as a phase transcended by the Christian epic's realism, which is shown to be ontogenetic, that is, quote, we are given to see in the realm of timeless being the history of man's inner life and unfolding. Yet Dante's Christian and post-Christian achievement could not have been realized had it not been for his immersion in what he inherited from classical culture, the capacity to draw human figures clearly, dramatically, and forcefully. In Auerbach's view, Western literature after Dante draws on his example but is rarely as intensely convincing in its variety, its dramatic realism, and stark universality as he was. Successive chapters of Mimesis treat medieval and early Renaissance texts as departures from the Dantean norm, some of them, like Montaigne in his essays, stressing personal experience at the expense of the symphonic whole, others, such as the works of Shakespeare and Rabelais, brimming over with a linguistic verve and resourcefulness that overwhelms realistic interpretation in the interests of language itself. Characters like Falstaff or Pantagruel are realistically drawn to a certain degree, but what is as interesting to the reader as their vividness are the unprecedented riotous effects of the author's style. It is not a contradiction to say that this could not have happened without the emergence of humanism, as well as the great geographical discoveries of the period. Both have the effect of expanding the potential range of human action, while also continuing to ground it in earthly situations. Auerbach says that Shakespeare's plays, for instance, adumbrate, quote, a basic fabric of the world, perpetually weaving itself, renewing itself, and connected in all its parts, from which all this arises and which makes it impossible to isolate any one event or level of style. Dante's general, clearly delimited figurality, in which everything is resolved in the beyond, in God's ultimate kingdom, and in which all characters attain their full realization only in the beyond, is no more. From this point on, reality is completely historical, and it, rather than the beyond, has to be read and understood according to laws that evolve slowly. Figural interpretation took for its point of origin the sacred word, or logos, whose incarnation in the earthly world was made possible by the Christ figure, a central point, as it were, for organizing experience and understanding history. With the eclipse of the divine that is presaged in Dante's poem, a new order slowly begins to assert itself, and so the second half of Mimesis painstakingly traces the growth of historicism, a multi-perspectival, dynamic, and holistic way of representing history and reality. And that is what eventually leads us to Proust, Joyce, and Woolf. And that's what he said. Hey, this is your host, Alec Mohibian, with a quick message before we continue. Based in that great but very troubled place, Hollywood, California, Filthy Armenian Adventures is an interdimensional travel program that takes you deep into the cultural mysteries of our time. In search of truth, in search of gold, in search of lost friends and unsung heroes, in search of John Galt's motor. This show is your antidote to the black pill. This is your guide to the places, the personalities, the ideas and creations the enemies of man don't want you to know. This is your techno-noir investigation into the good, the evil, and the God hiding under our noise. This is where you get the news before it breaks, before it blows, before it burns. The show is supported entirely by patrons at patreon.com/filthyarmenian. As a patron, you get access to twice as many adventures, including the most important ones, the ones with the real facts. Plus, regular brief smoke break spiritual reports on topics of the day. As a patron, you also get exclusive access to our Smash live events. Ask anyone who's attended one, and they will tell you it's an experience you'll never forget. It's very easy to keep Filthy Armenian Adventures alive. You can still listen to the show on your favorite app like Spotify or Apple, and you can do so with the pride that you're putting a little bit of money where your soul is. More patrons means more fuel, more topics, more investigations, more miracles, more secret locations, and forbidden territories around the world, and the world that is Los Angeles, our post-apocalyptic headquarters. It means we'll be able to track down more enchanting figures in the landscape, dare them to abandon their masks, and join our quest out of the darkness and into a golden age. Patreon.com/filthyarmenian. Thank you for being one of the good ones, and enjoy the show.
Right.
And it's also a matter of a soul that is subject to, as he frequently uses the word pendulum. It's like pendulum swings.
Yes.
A soul that, it's like, as his first chapter is on Homer's Odyssey, and his point in that chapter is he talks about how his takeaway is that Homer can be analyzed, as we have essayed to do here, but he cannot be interpreted, as he writes. But the most important thing is the multi-layeredness of the individual character. This is hardly to be met with in Homer, or at most in the form of a conscious hesitation between two possible courses of action. Otherwise, in Homer, the complexity of the psychological life is shown only in the succession and alternation of emotions, whereas the Jewish writers, he's talking about the Old Testament here, are able to express the simultaneous existence of various layers of consciousness and the conflict between them. All the characters in the Old Testament, you're dealing with massive contradictions that cover the full, like a full spectrum of humiliation and glory and lying and truth and all these various arcs are kind of contained within the stories of almost every major character in the Old Testament, and that marks a huge expansion of basically reality. Is the verdict there? It's like that's truer to life than anything permitted in Homer actually is.
Yeah, it's funny, like the you can that kind of thing he's observing in Homer is very, it's sort of something you can see people like natively come out with themselves when you read, like, if you ever have a friend who's like, you know, written a fantasy story or something and they want you to have a look at it or something,
Yeah.
you can
Oh
see
God.
people you can see
Thankfully,
people
I don't
kind
have
of
any
like
such friends anymore. But yeah.
you can see people kind of like natively you know, like recapitulating like literary history through their own literary efforts, because it's this very like instinctive move to make when a detail, when you've introduced a detail in the story, um it occurs to you, oh well, I need to go back and explain that detail, and so you just keep writing lore, right? Like like that's is what is happening in that moment in Homer is like, um Homer is observing that he's described something, and then it's occurring to him that he needs to go back and explain it, right? And so he's like, the story is becoming filled with this lore of how it is that he got this particular scar and so on. And the point that Auerbach makes is that even though that this is kind of like a movement backwards in time, um, narratively we're kind of remaining in the present. On the level of the sentence, we kind of remain within the present. And this is like, to go to the very, very, very last chapter when we get to Virginia Woolf and to the lighthouse. There's this, he's observing that there's this kind of blend of perspectives kind of weaving in and out of each other, of memory and observation of the present. So in between those 2 points, there's just like the whole entirety of of Western literature going through all these different permutations of a relationship with representation.
It's stunning when you consider just how when it dawns on you like what this actually means, and that's why I say that, like, just if you do nothing else, just read the first 2 chapters. I think it's all in the first 2 chapters. Basically, the sprouting of Western literature is going from antiquity to Jewish Christianity. Those are the first 2 elements. Basically, we know the works of antiquity, the classics, but it's that first transformation that opens up the entire new world that we live in, basically. And that in itself is such an exhilarating tale. I'll summarize first of all how he marks his progress in the Old Testament. He's talking about one of the David or someone in the Old Testament. The old man, of whom we know how he has become what he is more of an individual than the young man. For it is only during the course of an eventful life that men are differentiated into full individuality. And it is this history of a personality which the Old Testament presents to us as the formation undergone by those whom God has chosen to be examples. Fraught with their development, sometimes even aged to the verge of dissolution, they show a distinct stamp of individuality entirely foreign to the Homeric heroes. Time can touch the latter only outwardly, and even that change is brought to our observation as little as possible. Whereas the stern hand of God is ever upon the Old Testament figures. He has not only made them once and for all and chosen them, but he continues to work upon them, bends them and kneads them, and, without destroying them in essence, produces from them forms which their youth gave no grounds for anticipating. The older you get, the more individual you get, the more specific you get, the more you're shaped by experience and time and whatever and your own decisions and everything into a singular creature. When you're a kid, a lot of kids, you're just like, oh, there's you kind of are, you look, a lot of younger people seem similar to each other than older people do, or middle-aged people do. So there are of course exceptions to that, but you can see what he's driving at, and the importance of literary change, is storytelling change to individuality, not just like entertainment. In fact, it's always more. The other takeaway you get from here is that our entire sense of what a story is absolutely is a Christian structure. And that has not changed. That hasn't even remotely changed. There's been no matter how far people have departed from, the stricter 3-act structure and so on. I think this book makes it, as clear and as fixed as anything, that we are absolutely and totally still living within the, I'll say Judeo-Christian. It's ultimately the final, the Christian version that I think we most are most directly under, because that introduces the drama of salvation, which we still pervades our entire sense of any kind of story that we tell about ourselves, about our lives, about things that happen. It's still so fixed in that you cannot escape it without completely detaching yourself from Western culture whatsoever, and I don't know, maybe becoming a Buddhist.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've observed this before, but people don't really know what Christianity is, and they think that it's like a belief where if you believe in it, then it means that you read the Bible or something. It's not, people actually, talk about, we use these words like belief all the time, beliefs, but very rarely does anybody actually examine what tangible thing we may or may not be referring to, and so something like Christianity appears to be just like a, it's as if there is this platter of different religions or views we can take. I mean, I guess this is how, these things are represented to us in a sort of a civics class or a, college philosophy class or something, right? Everybody has their own beliefs and you can kind of pick or choose from them.
Yeah, which is total, not which is bullshit.
Yeah, and is ahistorical. This is the value of this kind of study, because you understand where all of these kind of imaginative and intellectual structures that we live inside that determine the you know the very way in which we conceptualize ourselves, in which we conceive of ourselves, how all of these things directly arise out of the kind of historical revolution in consciousness that's represented by Christianity. And that is literally what, historically Christianity is it's like a revolution with regard to the significance of the self that is, as Auerbach demonstrates, intimately tied into how the self, how psychology, what we think of today as psychology, or back then what we might have referred to as the soul, how these things are represented within and literature now has this feels like a sort of narrow term where it's like we're referring to novels, we're referring to poetry. But, the sort of survey of mimesis also includes historical writings, includes diaries. Um, it's just the development of like writing as a human practice that isn't to do with accounting, you know. Um, any kind of human writing is something that's been touched by this particular revolution and bears the marks of it in some way.
We think that movies have gone, we think that, the movie industry is a shadow of its former self. Of course it is. We think that the music industry is a shadow of its former self. It is. It is. Sure it is. All these things are shadow. It's all true. There is no distance in any of those pop cultural industries that can match the distance between the world of academia represented by this book and the world of academia as it exists today.
You can sort of tell that he is a I guess, in the best sense, a sort of thoughtful and liberally minded individual of his time, but it's sort of like in that sense, you see the decline of the true degeneration of what it means to be an open-minded person, right? Which is, I'm gonna say, the degeneration of what it means to be an open-minded person, um, as opposed to the degeneration of a liberal sensibility. Because I don't want to box him into that, um, but that is what the liberal sensibility used to signify, right? Is like somebody
Yes.
who had an interest and a curiosity in wide variety of different cultural traditions, a wide variety of different, um, types of literature, forms of literature, novels, poetry, works from different periods of history, and also, had a sense of intellectual responsibility to acquaint oneself with these things as a precondition to speaking authoritatively on them, and then also having this kind of pedagogical zeal to want to share the fruits of all of this study with the world. And this is a fairly tough book, but it's like there isn't it's an authentic toughness, it's an authentic complexity that doesn't come from obfuscation of trying to, hide an absence, hide something that isn't there. It's an authentic difficulty that comes from the breadth of the material that's being covered and what it is that he's drawing out of it. Um, so it's funny to read certain passages of his, especially like, for example, the chapter on Voltaire, where he's talking about Candide. It's like, one word that comes up that he uses a lot, or at least it's been translated as this word, is elasticity. He talks about certain writers having an elasticity of mind. I think
Yeah.
Montaigne he describes as having this.
The
Um,
consummate elasticity is Montaigne,
yeah,
basically. Yeah.
yeah. And in his handling of Voltaire and Voltaire's kind of ridicule or satirizing of who was it? Who had the monads? The best of all possible worlds guy.
Pangloss. No?
Pangloss is the guy in the
Is
book. Who's the real guy? Leibniz. He's giving a lot of praise to Voltaire's style, right? And he's like giving a very fair and even-handed account of. I mean, what he's really interested in is how these writers achieve their effects. And he's clearly uh someone who enjoys what like Voltaire is capable of doing with language, but he's also very even-handed, and he acknowledges that even on a kind of stylistic level, Voltaire's attack on Leibniz is not a kind of philosophically rigorous one. It's not like a fair one. But this isn't even, for him to observe this, I think this is really the thing that separates him from someone today. For him to make this observation isn't to align himself with a particular ideology or a particular like ideological orientation. It's purely something arising out of his own sense of like intellectual honesty, right?
Yes.
And
He's
that's
not taking sides. He takes
no,
sides in the
no,
sense of he will make judgments. Not, I'm
yes,
sorry, maybe he will make critical judgments. He will note when something seems a bit thin, a bit, uh, exhausted, a bit, no longer believable, a bit obviously propagandistic. He's very
yeah,
firm and he's very sharp with them. I mean, he's basically he's right about everything. I couldn't find a single judgment he made that was even remotely off base. He's actually presciently correct about everything, and like he will clearly mark when someone's being a bullshit artist, and he will basically, in not using the word bullshit, but he will basically point out how it's a work of bullshit art. And why it works so well as bullshit art. Like Voltaire specifically is someone who depends so strongly on rhythm and this
yes,
like rhythmic hypnotism that gets you that he points out is extremely removed from reality. Voltaire's world is a very unreal world. As is the world of most propagandists. It's like this. It's this world where as it painstakingly points out in many different cases, it's a world that seems real to you in the kind of ironical way that he delivers it. It has like a sort of humorous landing to you, and you accept his point very well. And it's a sort of satirical stick figure world. But if you actually hold it up to the light of reality, it's the things he's saying are obviously completely made up. I wish I had the example highlighted.
yeah.
Because
I'm trying to
there's a
find the passage where he talks about like I think he calls it like the searchlight method or something, which is this thing that he observes that Voltaire does. And it's really wild because he's basically kind of you know anticipating what is now like a very tired feature of um like Twitter rhetoric that I've
Yeah.
said a million times, which is like we're criticizing the point of view that we're like all made of magic dust floating on a space rock kind of thing. um we have like Auerbach kind of serenely um describing how this particular swindle is achieved, right? Before anybody even had put a name to it, or and also kind of correctly noticing without getting too kind of polemical about it, that this is a kind of this is a sort of a humanist tactic, or it's like a kind of rationalist tactic, right? Like it shows up in Voltaire, um, and it's continued to show up in the sort of like writing of people like, the Four Horsemen, for example.
I'm on it now. It's called The Interrupted Supper. It's one of my
It
favorite
is the
chapters in the
Interrupted
book.
Supper, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
The Interrupted Supper is another one of those chapters where if you were drifting before, actually the faux de veau before it too. There's like, yeah, like that's when I was like right back all the way in. When he starts getting into Montaigne and beyond, I'm way back in, because then at that point he's starting to not only make the distinctions between the generalist and the specialist, which came to be a big
Yeah,
theme,
yeah.
which is something, by the way, that's very relevant to our own time, because we kind of live in this. We are now living in the question of generalists versus specialists used to be basically in shorthand in the aristocratic periods of French culture. Specialism was looked down upon. You were thought to be a simple, narrow person if you were merely a this, a that, or that, or that. Whereas anyone of culture, everyone aspired to be a generalist, aspired to be someone who knows a little, who knows enough of many different things and is a fully rounded person. And Montaigne was a model of this, obviously, in his works. He was the master generalist. And it's very interesting to mark that distinction, because in the 20th century, especially post-war, specialism roared back. Everything became about specialism in terms of just everyday life and occupation, and also in academe went strongly into the specialist direction, especially after the 60s. And now we realize that experts suck. Their expertise is fake and bogus. And now we're turning away from that hardcore all of a sudden because we just realize how absolutely bogus even our most trusted forms of expertise, science, medicine, we're not talking even about a hocus pocus humanities. We're talking about even in the harshest sciences, expertise is structurally bogus. It's not just they were wrong about this one thing. It's that the entire structure of being an expert is incurably prone to fraud because you're getting your source, you are incentivized as an expert to lend your expertise toward the interests of those who fund you. Like that's the bottom line as an expert. And there's no, it is only if you could think about it, it is only the generalists. And now I'm talking here about discourse, right? And figuring out the truth these last several years. It has only been the generalists, exclusively the generalists. Joe Rogan is a generalist, right? Like just to use and I'm not saying he's right about everything or anything like that. I'm just saying the category of person who has been right about things in these last 5 years that we're most obsessed, let's say last 10, have been the category who is somehow able to achieve a generalism which is not beholden to a consensus, a industry consensus, a peer pressure, and all these things. And we can see this battle waging. And so it's really interesting to read about the development, the contrast between these two things in history and in this book. That tangent aside, the interrupted supper.
It's in reference to a excerpt from a sort of like a travel book about Voltaire's visit to London, right, where he goes and visits the stock exchange, and being this kind of wry Enlightenment Frenchman, he's making these like wry observations about how people of all different religions congregate together at the stock exchange and have this kind of productive relationship with each other, and then they go and do all of their kind of absurd religious rituals, and it's all like deeply familiar to kind of like like
it's a Richard Hanania tweet. It's a Richard Hanania. I'll read it right now, and I'll read the passage right now. This is from Voltaire in translation, of course. Enter the London Stock Exchange, that more respectable place than many a court. You will see the deputies of all nations gathered there for the service of mankind. There the Jew, the Mohammedan, and the Christian deal together as if they were of the same religion, and apply the name of infidel only to those who go bankrupt. There the Presbyterian trusts the Anabaptist, and the Anglican accepts the Quaker's promise. On leaving these peaceful and free assemblies, some go to the synagogue, others go to drink. One goes to have himself baptized in the name of the Father, through the Son, to the Holy Ghost. Another has his son's foreskin cut off and Hebrew words mumbled over him, which he does not understand. Others go to their church to await the inspiration of God with their hats on their heads, and all are content. So this is... Yeah.
Can I read his gloss of this passage? Because actually it's one of the funniest moments in the book.
Yeah.
So he says, this description of the London Exchange was not really written for a realistic purpose. What goes on there, we are told only in a general way. The purpose is much rather to insinuate certain ideas, which in their crudest and driest form would run as follows. Free international business, as dictated by the egotism of individuals, is beneficial to human society. It unites men in common pacific activities. Religions, on the other hand, are absurd. Their absurdity needs no proof beyond the observation that they are very numerous, while each claims to be the only true one, and that their dogmas and ceremonies are nonsensical. However, in a country where they are very many and very different, so that they are forced to put up with one another, they do not do much harm, and can be regarded as an innocuous form of madness. It is only when they fight and persecute one another that things get really bad. So that's kind of like Auerbach's like sarcastic gloss of what Voltaire is saying there, and it's kind of like, I mean, it's like, kind of thing that I would like sarcastically tweet at someone who had tweeted like
Exactly.
what.
It's a Yeerk tweet. That's a Yeerk tweet that you just read. Yeah, that really is. I
um
mean, and he goes on to further excoriate the ridiculousness of, not the ridiculousness, but the trickery of that passage. Which he says that which in which he points out that the passage places business and religion side by side and puts the business ahead of religion. And he says the very device of coupling the two as though they were forms of human endeavor on the same plane and to be judged from the same viewpoint is not only an impertinence, it is a specific approach, or if one prefers, an experimental setup in which religion is ipso facto deprived of what constitutes its essence and its value. It is presented in a position in which it appears ridiculous from the start. This is a technique which sophists and propagandists of all times have employed with success, and Voltaire is a master of it. It is for precisely this reason that here, where he wants to demonstrate the blessings of productive work, he chooses neither a farm, nor a business office, nor a factory, but the stock exchange, where people of all faiths and backgrounds congregate. And so then he continues to analyze. He really deeply analyzes like passages like this for many, many pages in ways that are just so.
not to sort of like we're kind of doing dueling readings, but the his description of what he calls the searchlight device, um this propaganda device, which is often used far more crudely and maliciously than in this case. So he's actually being fair to Voltaire here, but he says it might be called the searchlight device. It consists in over illuminating one small part of an extensive complex, while everything else that which might explain, derive, and possibly counterbalance the thing emphasized is left in the dark. So that apparently the truth is stated, for what is said cannot be denied, and yet everything falsified, for truth requires the whole truth and the proper interrelation of its elements. Which is, yeah, that's just a really wonderful passage, and that's what I was when I was rambling about, like, you know, um, this sort of applicability of what he's saying to, you know, familiar pieces of discourse that show up on Twitter or places. This is what I'm referring to because, you see people doing the searchlight method or the searchlight device all the time. It's still something that's in use. And I've never seen it actually kind of fixed so well and observed so well before.
And he's never unfair. I mean, he's identifying exactly what it is. Not only, he's identifying the trickery of Voltaire, but he's identifying in a way that specifically highlights why Voltaire is so special. I mean, why he's so good.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
this is like,
ironically, this is him praising Voltaire in a
he's
sense,
praising
right?
Voltaire. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
He's praising his gifts. I mean, that's the thing that people are we're so, especially in the academic sense, crippled in our ability to praise what we disapprove of. Like, we're not, like, he does not share Voltaire's pure rationalist Enlightenment philosophy at all. Because if he did, he wouldn't be as brutal. He wouldn't be as capable of, I think, detecting all the phoniness. I mean, all the trickery of it. He's able to analyze exactly what's going on and exactly what makes it powerful. It's just an objective. There's an objectivity here that is the height of human criticism, and we seem to have lost that, because it's like, if you don't have the ability, if you don't agree with something, or if you hate something too much, it becomes very hard to, in our present day, to truly appreciate why it works.
At certain moments during this, like the Don Quixote chapter, for example, I was reminded of Harold Bloom, and I don't think in the Bloom I've read, I don't know if he's ever alluded to Auerbach. Uh, and I don't know Bloom's like specific feelings about him, but obviously, his reputation as this kind of culture war figure who, named the school of resentment, which is kind of what we're referring to, the state of academia now. He was right about all of this stuff, but there's this kind of irony, I think, in how someone like Bloom is perceived, where he's kind of viewed as like a mean old man. Why was he such a mean old man who, he said so many mean things about how nobody reads anymore or whatever. Um, but you know, when I see interviews with him or I read some of his I read some of his books or whatever, um, I feel what I'm detecting from him isn't like really hostility, it's just grief. It's a very, very deep grief at this at what he was observing at the time, which was, I mean, resentment is the perfect word for it because
Yeah.
it's something that can only exist in a culture of low standards. It is resentment towards like the greatness of a given text, like, Don Quixote or the Odyssey or something. The resentment of the student who wants an academic career but feels a kind of inferiority or an imposter syndrome that they are not up to the task of engaging with this material, but has been dangerously equipped with a set of quasi-academic rationalizations in the language of critical theory, in the language of Foucault or whoever, to dismiss these books out of hand, right? Rather than having this authentically humanist attitude of seeing what she can learn from them, seeing what they can teach her about, what it is to be human, about human civilization, about history, about all of these things. Um, it's, you know, immediately kind of greeting the book on in bad faith and on hostile terms, and finding a reason to dismiss it.
It's small souled, and it's
Small
and
souled,
it's
yeah,
that's
exactly,
the
yeah.
bottom line. It's just small souled, and there's nothing that's more offensive to a sensitive person, a truly
Yeah.
sensitive in the good way, than someone who is small souled, especially if their job is the stewardship of culture, literature, and the soul. Like, it's like seeing a priest who doesn't believe in God. It's like you,
Oh yeah, it's being a
it's
false
like
shepherd.
yeah, it's like there's nothing. Yeah, false shepherds are absolutely outrageous. I mean, they just drive you crazy, and it's not someone who is a mistaken shepherd or who's even a retarded shepherd, incapable shepherd. That can be maddening too. I mean, there are plenty of those, and they're problems too. But when you see someone who specifically sets out to lead the flock in the wrong direction because the right direction is too harsh on their skin, the light is too harsh on their skin in the right direction, it just it's enough.
Oh
And then you see
yeah,
that person
no,
be rewarded for that, for his
there's
for that.
there's a real malice to it.
Yeah, it is
Um,
malice. I'm not a huge Bloomian because I think that he was a little bit, he kind of claimed for himself exclusively what others were even before him fighting for. And I think that he, that kind of that's created some resentment to Bloom from conservatives. By our standards, that's not that
well,
important.
he's like the first guy that you read, right? Because he's like the Western canon. I mean, I still love Harold Bloom. I probably always will, because reading Anxiety of Influence was such a formative moment for me. But it is really nice to read a literary theorist who isn't Harold Bloom or Camille Paglia, as much as I love her
Yeah.
too. For this, I was reading my dad's copy from his university days, when he was studying literature, and we have so many of these old kind of like classics of literary theory kind of lying around the house, um, like The Mirror and the Lamp by M.H. Abrams, and um, I don't know, many, many others. And I'm always meaning to pick them up and read them and never getting around to it. So, it was nice. It was nice to have a reason to finally read Mimesis.
There are books out there, guys. I mean, I just found something randomly at a bookshop in Barcelona by, I think the name of the author is J.B. Priestley. Does that ring a
Oh
bell to you? 'Cause
yeah,
he's English. Yeah, it's
Yes,
another like
he wrote an Inspector Calls, which was on the GCSE curriculum for a while. Like a
oh,
very
I've seen an
yeah,
Inspector
yeah,
Calls. Yeah, I've seen
yeah,
that one.
yeah.
I saw it on like in a filmed theatrical version on Amazon, I think.
Oh, nice,
I
nice.
have the book right here, and I've read a little bit into it because it's very readable, and it's called Literature and Western Man, you know, and it's like it's far less rigorous than Erich Auerbach, but it's like a written for popular consumption,
Oh yeah.
and I'm just like blown away. I'm just in the beginning basically, but it's another one of these things where he's drawing, literature and Western men. He's drawing this grand sweep. It's like a sexual personae and type of deal, but with, focused on literature and like the history of thought. And it's just an amazing. It's so it's so good. It's so interesting.
I love finding books like that. Like by people like J.B. Priestley. I think I have a PDF somewhere of I think it's a book he wrote about the writer Thomas Love Peacock, who's a kind of enthusiasm of mine. Um, so even like their kind of the works for which they're known, like in Inspector Calls in Priestley's case, it's lovely to just happen upon these kind of like lesser known critical works of theirs. Um, I was gonna say, have you ever read any Northrop Frye?
I've heard of him, but I don't think I've ever read anything by him.
Um,
Should I?
you should really check out the Anatomy of Criticism,
Okay,
which
I'll
is
put that.
kind of like Frye's equivalent of what Auerbach is doing in this book. Um, but Frye is such a kind of he's such a sort of like witty, friendly, gentlemanly, authorial presence. Um, he's just like a pleasure to read on the level of personality, for one thing. But he's also like similarly to Auerbach, he's like breathtakingly erudite, and he's also, they're kind of comparable in interesting ways because Fry is trying to create a sort of almost scientific um sort of system of organizing literature according to archetypes, but not in a kind of mystical Jungian way. More like for Fry, archetype is more like just a sort of unit of literature, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Um, and he organizes the point of connection with Auerbach is that he's like organizing literature into different eras and then classifying them according to what he calls high mimetic or low mimetic. And I can't remember how these terms correspond exactly to what, but I mean, it really is. It's like it's such a pleasure to read, and it's similarly kind of epic in scope in terms of providing an overview of Western literature.
Yeah, I will get to all of these in due course, and I will also have to read Anxiety of an Influence, which I actually never read. Um, I will also read that to be fair to Bloom, and I don't want to like just simply go off other people's distaste for him. It's what's funny. I opened this book up, this Priestley book up randomly, and the first thing I see in the page I open up is him quoting Erich Auerbach and Mimesis specifically
Incredible.
on the question of whether literature has lost its mass appeal. So yeah, the Voltaire is a great chapter. The way he analyzes Voltaire, and he identifies tempo as a big part of Voltaire's philosophy, the tempo and his skill. He points out how limited of reality a style that is entirely designed to propagate the views of the Enlightenment philosophy is. I find it very interesting to consider all this kind of sweep, this grand thesis in light of where we are today, where we have been in the last 10 years, because the general assumption is that, literature has gotten gradually literature, and he includes like cinema and everything else too when he's talking about the present. Like our expectations have tended toward the more realistic, right? Over in the big picture, we expect more realism, we think, than ever before. As time goes on, this thing that this thing is much, captures reality much more completely, and we kind of praise it like we did with The Wire. Like, oh wow, that was like a really, The Wire showed the
Yeah,
reality
yeah.
of life, life in the police department, whatever, in a way that television never had before, and we get crazy about that. But it definitely seems like that has stopped. That stopped about as soon as the libtard tens came into full power. There were some exceptions where like people thought that basically reality was outsourced to diversity, and if you were to depict enough, racial obliqueness on screen, if you were to show characters who are very diverse and who are kind of sitting around and doing nothing, that was like an achievement of reality, that like Master of None, where like the black lesbian is sitting in her car texting for 10 minutes, and that was considered to be an advancement in the cause of reality on television.
Tragic youth was looking young and sexy. The tragic youth was wearing tattered black jeans, bearing arms and floating halls of mischief. The tragic youth was going down on me, but I swear, yes, I swear. I built a wall of sound to separate us. I hid among the junk of wretched highs. I spent from planet X to planet Alpha, struggling for reality.
Obviously, there's the question of reality TV, which I think most people recognize is, in a sense, the opposite of reality, but in another sense, not. I mean, I don't know what your takes are on reality TV are, but I would like to discuss the kind of state of reality now, like how we know it's contracted. We both talk about it endlessly. How there's so much has been like you're not even allowed to show a legitimately real couple on television in the last 10 years, because it always has to be somewhat biracial, somewhat the man always has to be a bitch, the woman always has to be right about everything, there has to always be a minority character who's the saintly one, and so on and so forth, and reality was sort of erased. What's your sense of that current drama right now, about how real we want to be?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of died down a little bit now, but we've just kind of passed through, like, only a few weeks ago, really, this you know strange period. I mean in the UK, I'm talking about, like, we passed through this strange period of like collective mania or hysteria that is kind of I can only imagine is akin to, like, when Princess Diana died or something, in terms of its sort of hysteria, to do with the TV show Adolescence, which is about a kind of, entirely imaginary scenario, which is this like young kid who is like radicalized by, like, Andrew Tate and black pilled content online, and stabs a girl in his class. And the pitch of hysteria that this reached was such that, like, the leader of the opposition um was, in a sort of like a hostile interview, where she was like questioned for not having watched this TV show because it was assumed that it was like her, you know, responsibility as the opposition leader to watch this show and to acquaint herself or educate herself on the dangers facing, young British boys. And this is in a country that, it was only like a few months before that Elon brought everybody's attention back to the grooming gangs, which is something that's been going on for like 20 years. And obviously there was also the extremely brutal and horrific Southport attacks where these like, little girls were murdered. Um, and obviously, it was not a radicalized white incel like little boy who committed this, So these like extremely like horrendous things which kind of um you know reveal in some way something fundamental about the state of the country right now. Bizarre the way they're so explicitly like overwritten by this middlebrow Netflix drama that hits all of these kind of signifiers of middlebrow credibility, right? Because it has, for example, like one shot sequences, right? Where there are no like I think it's like one shot per episode or something like that, and
It's
everybody
one.
goes on.
Really, they're oneers.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
that's how it is.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh
yeah,
God.
yeah. That's like the
Oh
big
fuck.
gimmick,
Oh my.
you know. It's like Akira slide, one shot long. Like I mean, I find it kind of like, to me that is extremely vulgar, but it apparently it's
Oh
impressive to many people. And and it signifies a degree of it sort of signifies a thoughtfulness that's actually not inherent in the show itself,
yeah. Of course, it's a fake show off
Yeah.
thing that it's one
Yeah,
thing if a great
yeah.
film. It's like one thing if it's done, in some fabuloso way in a manner that brings exhilaration, but to do it in such a obviously propagandistic show as a way of tricking people into thinking it's some sort of real document of humanity that they must take super super duper seriously and
Yeah, the other little, I think this is like a subtle detail that I think a lot of people have missed, but this is also part of its kind of part of the way it like signifies credibility is who was involved in it? I mean, it was put out on Netflix. Oh yeah, but it was produced by Warp Films, and Warp Films is the like film branch of Warp Records. And Warp Records is like, this famous like British IDM label who've put out like Aphex Twin and Autica and Square Pusher and Boards of Canada and all this kind of stuff, right? And Warp Films, the first thing they put out was like a Chris Morris movie. And then things like Shane Meadows, like Dead Man's Shoes, like, so they actually have this kind of like alt culture, this almost like hangover from the 90s, like alt culture credibility, right?
oh
And that's a
God.
big part of it as well, I think. That's kind of overlooked. But anyway, sorry, I'm kind of rambling.
Well, no, it's important. I'd
But
like to connect it to this because this is a show, Adolescent, which I have not watched and I will not watch unless someone pays me. But it's obviously having a huge. It's being employed toward immensely devious ends. I'm glad at least I don't. I live in America where I went through 10 years of this, and now we can kind of look at it in the rear view. We can look at what a future might be like, and now it seems
yeah,
like like the culture of 10 years ago is being now just finally sprouting in the UK, through the form of this kind of unified, totalitarian cultural product, this disgusting show, Adolescent. I mean, lay into it some more because it's everything that's wrong with our time. This fake, sophisticated, fake real, fake edgy, fake documentarian with each episode in the one shot that specifically is designed to demonize young white boys, probably the most oppressed demographic in the entire UK.
Yeah, I mean, just like I think it engages in what my friend Alex refers to as sympathy management, because behind the sentimentality of the show, which is ostensibly, the takeaway from it you're supposed to get is, oh, men aren't allowed to talk about their feelings enough, and they need masculine role models, and they're falling into the hands of, these influencers, because I guess their emotional lives aren't fulfilled enough or nurtured enough to guide them onto a better path or something. Um, but behind that, there's like an enormous like suspicion and hostility towards, you know, just quiet, sensitive young boys who aren't hurting anybody, but maybe a bit shy, maybe have a deep interest in a particular subject. Um, are maybe quiet, maybe have a hard time making friends, are lonely. Really, the least the dangerous people, but like they are the recipients of society's indifference. And because society is indifferent towards them, there is this kind of bad faith anxiety on the part of society that this is going to come home to roost at some point, right? There's this fear
Ugh.
that like we've been indifferent to this demographic for such a long time, we don't actually know what's psychologically going on with them anymore, right?
Right.
And so I think that that also contributes to the demonization, right? I mean, ironically, Edward Said, I think, was very influenced by Erich Auerbach, which is ironic
He
in all
writes
sorts
the
of
intro in
ways.
my edition.
Yeah,
He writes the intro.
yeah, but ironically, young British boys have become a sort of orientalized subject in the UK, right? So they've become, as I said in a tweet once, they've become a kind of dark other, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
the implicitly kind of feminine character of, British educational institutions and media institutions is completely baffled by the inner life of these boys. It has no clue about it. It doesn't know what's happening there, and it's afraid of it. But it also, in its pride, it can't acknowledge it's afraid because that would mean acknowledging its own pattern of indifference towards. And obviously it could never do that because that's unkind, and it's a big part of the ego formation of this kind of feminine personality, this feminine persona that dominates these institutions, that it is kind, that it can never have done anything that isn't kind.
Right.
Um,
That it could
and
never
so,
have been, yeah,
so
a
this is just one
horrific
way in
bitch for.
which, like, this show essentially is a kind of ego crutch for maintaining the, the
Yeah.
narcissistic, like fantasies of this kind of personality, right? Like that's what is ultimately so hypocritical and sick about it to me. It's because it's all about all of this stuff is about trying to reconcile the actual cracks in reality that are represented by first of all an uneasy awareness of its own indifference and its own hatred and fear of young boys, but also then the actual real violence that's been perpetrated against British girls, predominantly white working class British girls by you know Pakistani
By
rape gangs
Pakistanis.
or
Yeah, by
yeah,
Pakistanis
you know
who they've allowed, who their great whom the great empathic border policies, immigration policies have allowed to flood the country. Well, that's just great. Part of me is just like when you microanalyze it, the outrage returns to your body. But then you have to take one step back, and I go, well, maybe we should be enjoying this, because it seems absolutely impossible for these people who spent the last 15 years and in complete disregard, and it's really longer than we think. I mean, it only became overt 10, 12 years ago with wokeness. But long before that, I would say the indifference to the male was there. I mean, The War on Boys by Christina Hoff Sommers was written in the 90s. The entire academic system, the entire pedagogical system in the West had become extremely feminized for decades and decades. Everything about it was kind of, with the exception of its allowance for sports and stuff like that, everything about it was kind of structured in a way as to be completely ignorant of how young boys operate. It's just not something that's designed for young boys. It's not designed. It doesn't accommodate the form and the kind of creatural realities, as Erich Auerbach might say, of a young boy, to lock him up into a classroom from the age of 4, with a little bit of running around time in between 8-hour sessions. It's so far removed from what is good for a boy, and for that reason, we have seen girls completely leapfrog boys academically. They're just better at that. It's better. It's more designed for girls, and that was the case for decades. Then in the last 15 years, that indifference was compounded with contempt and with villainization, and with a complete eradication of male identity and reality as being toxic. Now it's like the people who did all that, I don't see any off-ramp for them. They're trying to find one because they're noticing that they lost the boys. And they're noticing especially with these beautiful statistics regarding the support levels for Donald Trump and how strong they are among young boys. And the younger the boys, the stronger the support levels. And boy, if you've been listening to this show and preceding the election and so on, you'll know how satisfying it feels to see these numbers, each new number better than the last. And the younger the boy, the better the number. And even the young girls now, even the younger, like the youngest Gen Z girls are figuring things out. And it's so satisfying. And then you look at the counterploy, which is a show like Adolescence, and you think to yourself, I do think that they've run out of ideas and that they're never going to be able to wiggle out of this jam. And that these people are going to continue to self-destruct in their utter irrelevance and total and complete obsolescence to the issues that matter of today. Do you feel that potential relish, or are you concerned that there's going to be some sort of totalitarian rejoinder to the attempt to liberate the Western male?
Well, I mean, I occupy a very particular position within this because of my own kind of cultural and class background, right? Because I'm sorry to anybody who's heard me say this, because I say this to like everybody I speak to, but like, if you're a British middle class person who's, fairly intelligent and you're growing up in the mid 2000s, this was like a kind of golden era of intelligent British comedy and satire. And it was people like Chris Morris, who I just mentioned. I don't know if you're familiar, who did The Day-to-Day and Brass Eye, and kind of more recently, not that recently, but he did the movie Four Lions.
I'm not familiar, no. I should look into it.
Okay, well, Brass Eye is probably the thing he's best known for. Oh, and Jam, which was like a really creepy kind of acid sketch show. But Brass Eye was kind of like a parody of British news specials or like special report programs from the kind of mid early to mid 2000s, right? And each episode was supposedly about a different theme. So one of them was animal cruelty, one of them was on drugs. The most infamous one was on pedophilia because the sort of, what was then regarded as like the moral panic surrounding that had just been getting off the ground in the tabloids at the time. And but it was like a satire of these things, and it was a satire of the kind of language and grammar of these programs and of news. And part of the format was that he would get these kind of oblivious, middling British celebrities like Rolf Harris to come on, and they'd think it was like a real program, and they'd be saying the most absurd stuff, like this completely batshit stuff that any intelligent person should have been able to see through. And obviously, the satirical point is that these celebrities are so kind of obsessed with, their moral image and presenting themselves as like, some kind of national voice of conscience or something that they can't realize the absurdity of what they're saying, right? And
Yeah.
sorry, so this is kind of long-winded, but like the significance of this is that I was sort of socialized in a way by media like this show, right? Because a show like that would teach you to be skeptical about moral panics, about media manipulation, about media narratives, right? And more informally, it taught you to be suspicious of a certain small c conservative Little Englander mindset, the sort of curtain twitching, Daily Mail reading person who doesn't like immigrants, doesn't like drugs or whatever, just kind of puritanical, is small-minded, and so on. And so if you're like a teenager, you're finding out about the world, you're reading books and stuff, you define yourself in opposition to that mentality, right? And I bring all this up because, you know, um, I am, there are people who still think that this informal structure is in place, right? They still locate themselves in this way, in the same way that I did in the mid 2000s. They think that there are these kind of cognitive shortcuts to occupying a reasonable position, right? Which is that because you don't want to be the Daily Mail moral panic small c conservative person. And the sort of historical irony that this generation of people have gone through is that they all saw this program and took the right message from it, but they don't realize that by clinging to this identity as like the adult in the room, the reasonable person with a capital R, they are now the dumb celebrity, the stupid celebrity who has been hoodwinked into believing total obvious absurdities that no serious adult should believe in, should have an
Yeah.
excuse for believing in, right? And they're now kind of trapped. They're like held hostage by this, right?
Yeah.
And and so, my particular relationship to it is I feel, I feel a degree of contempt and disappointment at these people. And I guess there's something of the kind of like the jilted lover or whatever. I feel a sense of betrayal, right? Because I like in terms of my particular, psychodrama, my family romance, this is a I'm speaking metaphorically here, but this is a figure who's let me down, right? This
Yeah.
is a figure who is supposed to be a reliable guide to the world, but by trying to stay true to my own sense of what is reasonable, right? Which was, partly inculcated by this kind of media, like this show. Not that show exclusively, but that was, one of the things that was in my orbit. Um, you're also sort of like cast out of the castle. But now, you can see from the outside that the castle is in a bad state. It's kind of crumbling. It's cobwebbed. There is a bad smell coming from inside, and these people are still in the windows, like jeering down at you. you
Yeah.
know, and sort of like thinking that they they're the ones who look good in the situation, right? So it's yeah, it's pretty wretched.
Yeah, it's all the House of Usher at this point. And the it's so interesting that, what you put it in those terms of how you were kind of let down by the celebrities that inspired you in your adolescence and in your coming of age, which are the most important celebrities, obviously. I mean, these are the ones who, and in your early
Well,
20s, and like,
they were people I would consider artists who at one time were capable of having an incisive, intelligent view of the world, right?
yeah,
And now they've been resting on their laurels. And I mean, another one of these people is Armando Iannucci, right, who wrote The Thick of It. Um, and what else did he do? He also worked with Chris Morris on some things. But when Elon Musk was, tweeting about the grooming gangs or whatever, um, Armando Iannucci, he had a Twitter account. Maybe he still does, but he wrote this really bitch made wounded tweet, it was in this like wounded tone where he was like, we can deal with our own problems in Britain. We don't need Elon Musk telling us, but this is in reference to the grooming gangs. I mean, this is
mhm,
an unsolved problem that's it's never satisfactory. It's like the worst case of institutional failure. I mean, it's beyond description how bad it is. So, it's just like at this point, how anyone can say that, Britain is capable of solving its own problems, that's not a reasonable statement. That's insane. You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
it's just
Especially
it's
when
not
there's no
serious.
especially when there's no acknowledge continues to be no acknowledgement of the problem, right? I mean, they're not
No,
fully
no.
acknowledging the problem. They're blaming it on white boys somehow with this. So, I mean, they're transferring the blame onto this mythical incel, 13-year
Yeah.
old white incel. Like
Well, and
that's
what they
who the
do,
Pakistani grooming gangs are being represented by in Britain's confrontation with this problem. A
well, there was
13-year
another
old white
incident
boy.
a while ago where, there was like an acid attack on some woman, and that, there was this I don't know if he was Pakistani or what, but this guy, or I mean, he was an immigrant of some kind, I'm fairly sure. I have to qualify that because I don't, there's also this kind of like ambient risk that you'll just get like the police at your door and, if it's like spreading misinformation or something. Um, but this guy threw acid on a woman, and then he got some on him, so he had this scarring on his face. He was wandering around the UK, showing up on surveillance cameras for days, and then no one knows what happened to him. But like the reaction from various, I can't remember which one specifically, but from various like bloody brilliant women Labour MPs where they would, release these statements denouncing the misogyny problem in this country. It'd be like the misogyny problem, the way that particular kind of laundering, which poses as something that's getting to the heart of the issue, that poses as something that's radical in some way, right? Um, but is actually, using this ostensibly sociological view to obfuscate, right? Because,
Yeah,
okay, yeah, like, there's a specific type of culturally bound misogyny that's occurring here. And any honest person can see that. So they engage in this kind of, I guess, this like economy of blame quite often. It's always important for the blame to be kind of uh sort of diffused, or dissipated into the country at large. It has to be sort of dissolved within the, I don't know, like the kind of mist of general institutional misogyny or whatever, right? It can never be like specified down. So that is more convenient because the more institutional, which is a euphemism for, vague, the more institutional it is, the less anybody can do anything about it because it's this kind of intangible smoke. But there's also the added bonus of like every man in the UK is collectively kind of ambiently scolded, right? You know, even though clearly the vast majority of men, especially, British men, don't throw acid on people and wouldn't, you know.
You would hope. Yeah. There's like, I feel like, the question is kind of whether there's going to be a gradual like awakening in the institutional sense, and like are they going to be able to repair themselves, or is there going to be a true and complete like destruction of these institutions and their replacement being necessary? What's your read on that in the UK? Because from where I'm standing, to some degree, you can see people course correct, and you can see them doing it already, especially the ones who were never really didn't have their hearts in it in the first place, and they were just conforming to the madness. But there are so many who are composed entirely of the madness that it seems like they don't have the reality muscles to bring it back to mimesis. They don't have this, like they don't exist in a world where they can understand what they have done. They can understand what they don't know.
Yeah.
And they can achieve an amount of respect for the fullness of humanity that they think that they currently possess, but which is in fact a sham empathy, not a real empathy. It's a tenderness for abstractions, not for real human beings. And it seems it's very hard to imagine how these people are going to be just have the tools, even if they want to kind of rehumanize themselves.
Yeah. There's this like line from this writer Steve Aylett where he talks about, I want to get it right. He says something like, the notion that human denial has a limit is only possible because it doesn't, or something like that, because I marvel at the kind of psychic pressure that so many of these people must be under, to the energy it must take to go around carrying these kind of contradictions on their shoulders. But you think that eventually the pressure will be too much and they'll kind of snap and break, but they don't. They get kind of worse.
They don't break because, as someone who has studied cults extensively and witnessed a very interesting inversion of the kind of accepted wisdom about cults, which is that a cult is this, relatively small organization that forms around a charismatic personality that is, off conventional reality, off center, off whether even if it pretends to be something that's moderate, like a business cult or something, even if it pretends to be something that's not politically extreme or ideologically extreme, but is just sort of a lifestyle thing, whatever it is, there's an assumption that it's an oblique and kind of small thing, which therefore, when the promises of its leadership are proven to be false, and people are confronted with that confrontation, confronted with that contradiction between the promises of the flawless leader being wrong, and how they're supposed to reconcile that with everything they've been led to believe, and a lot of them do crack. A lot of others double down until they eventually crack because the pressure is so great from without, that, and at some point the cult leader flees with all the money, so you don't even have anybody to, there's nothing, the structure crumbles so much that most of them eventually, even though through great pain and difficulty, and sometimes through the consequence of being much worse off after the fact than they were within the cult, lose their illusions. But it's different when the cult is the orthodoxy, when
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
they're the ones who are possessed of this of the delusional and completely fake and false prophecies and false everything. It's different when that's the case, because then you're talking about like the Soviet Union and the inner party. Like then you're talking about
yeah,
massive organizations which you can again, like that's even a government, a totalitarian government in a way has less power, because it's like it's this entity that people have been hating for years, and that has been distrusted, and that kind of every atrocity can be attributed to, and if it eventually cracks, you can like see the light of day and be like, well, everything I said before, I was just pretending, because if I didn't say it,
yeah,
I'd be
yeah,
sent to jail. But this particular thing that we've been in, this Western version of totalitarian lunacy, is kind of a different animal than either the kind of old fascist or communist version at a government level, or at what we understand to be a small scale cult. And so it's very interesting to me. There's so much room to just sort of graze forever like a retarded cow, that
yeah, yeah.
I don't know how people are going to be. I don't know how much people even need to be, are going to be confronted with this, with how wrong they are, to the degree that they're going to be forced to either completely go crazy or start to wake up. I don't know how much of that is necessary. So that's why it's kind of an especially interesting question, it seems like, how this is going to play out.
Yeah, well, I mean, I saw another relevant thing to bring up is the recent like Supreme Court ruling on the definition of women in the UK Equality Act, which ruled that, a woman is a biological adult human female, which obviously is a huge blow against kind of, I guess, gender, like gender goblinery,
Yeah.
the forces of like gender goblinism in the UK, and this is also a kind of slightly kind of schizophrenic moment now, because now you have someone like Keir Starmer having to go and like clarify that he agrees with the Supreme Court ruling, you know. Um, Whereas this would have been an unspeakable thing some time ago. And in fact, not that long ago, he was asked the question of what he believed about this. Um, and I think his response was to, I think to the assertion that, a woman has a cervix, he said something really mealy-mouthed, like, it is a thing that should not be said, right?
Mm.
Um, but now he's had to go and actually clarify, that he does agree with the Supreme Court ruling. So it's like this very like uncertain moment in terms of I don't think I mean, with regard to this particular issue, but I mean, if it can happen with that issue, it can happen with other issues too, where what has been for a time a settled consensus, right, that we all agree that, trans women or whatever, has suddenly been and very conclusively unsettled. And um, you know, it's now harder for the average person to kind of coordinate their own feelings about it, or coordinate how they think they should feel about it with a wider mass consensus that's been, you know, laid out for them, like so many things, right? And you can actually like trace this tension. I don't know why I keep going back to British comedy, but like you can kind of trace this tension in um kind of news comedy panel shows, right? Where Have I Got News for You, which is like this famous British comedy panel show. A real dinosaur. It hasn't been funny in decades, but um, it was noticed that they didn't address it in the episode that you know, most closely followed on from the Supreme Court ruling. And then they did address it today, literally, right? But even in addressing it, you can sort of discern their kind of like discomfort or edginess with the topic. They don't know quite how to um kind of integrate it into the overall attitude of the show that they have, right? And that's going to be true of a lot of things, right? I think we're going to be seeing a lot of these really like dissonant culture war notes in things
Yeah.
where things that appeared to be kind of immutable consensus are going to have these big cracks appearing in them. And then it's a matter of, people who felt too scared to say anything for a long time gradually getting kind of braver, right? And feeling that it's safe to actually speak up and say what they think about things. And that is what will, one would hope would initiate the kind of snowballing effect that eventually arrives at a place of sanity where we can all look back and go, oh, isn't it crazy that we all believed in this shit, you know? And it will seem like a kind of bizarre, like you said, Soviet period of history. But who knows? I mean, every now and again, Keir Starmer will come out and say something kind of weirdly edgy, right? Like he
Yeah.
came out a little while ago and said that, like, you know, immigration was too high and the Labour government had to do something about it because people had put up with it for too long. Right? Every now and again, he comes out and it's like, it's the dark Starmer. He'll come and say something that's sort of, you know.
Well, there is the one thing that speaks to these people more than anything is power. And when they sense that they are going to lose power unless they do X, Y, or Z, they will be find themselves doing X, Y, or Z because
Yeah.
power is their ultimate language. Power is what they is the entirety of their uh it seems of their composition, like of their aspiration and of their ambition. They have obviously it has been coded in various socialistic liberal ideals, but it is such a strong force in them that it has a tendency to break through. And I mean, even with we saw that with uh, as obviously legitimate as communist ideals were, and as real as true believers were, it didn't seem to bother anybody in power in the Soviet Union to cling to that power after the Soviet Union fell, and to
Mm.
kind of claim to be, to change basically on a dime in terms of the purity of their belief in the international brotherhood, as it seemed to be that the international brotherhood is not very convenient for their economic concerns in the moment. And so, I do think that there's been a lot of this has been driven by conformity, by cowardice, by people who just want power playing along, and not by legitimate, conviction. Um, it's just going to be interesting to see how capable these people even are at this point. There are obviously true believers still. I mean,
Well, to actually unpack that a little bit, this is something that, is sort of relevant to the book Mimesis, right? Because it's to do with how we represent authenticity or how we represent sincerity, right? And I think you're completely right that like a lot of this stuff is pure cowardice, is pure conformity. Um, it's virtue signaling or platitude reciting, an opportunity to increase one's social stature by saying the right things whilst having no stake in the reality. And people are aware on some level that that's what they're doing, but the way they compensate for that, right, is um is actually through kind of investing what they do with emotional energy, with this performance of emotion, right? Because, and I think this is, one of the earliest observations I can remember making on my account, but I think it's still true that, you know, uh, in the way that like critical theories drip down into popular culture through Tumblr or whatever, um, it had kind of problematized, what we'd think of as like methods of intellectual or rational inquiry, right? And because those things now that then felt kind of radioactive because everybody had internalized this little critical theorist in their head that would attack these things, there was a retreat to emotion as a kind of correspondingly authentic thing that was kind of unimpeachable. It couldn't be critical theoryified, right? So there was this like massive investment going on into feelings as this marker of authenticity, right? And that actually became the method of self-deception, was like you decide that you're gonna publicly attach yourself to some kind of untruth, right? But the way that you prove to yourself that what you're doing is not dishonest is you invest it with this histrionic emotionality, right? And that's what your way of proving to other people and also to yourself that you're not lying, that this is true in some sense, right? This is like a this is how people are like representing a certain emotional reality to themselves, right? And that's that the important lesson that taught me, was that like um actors like conjure emotions inside themselves all the time. Emotions are not like this authentic thing. There are things that we feel, but you can kind of summon them up inside yourself too, right? I mean, and this is actually, this connects to so many things. It connects to like, Me Too and the sort of neurosis about sex and consent and things like that too, right? But anyway, yeah, I digress.
No, yeah, it's like the I'm like trying to draw a connection to like improv. In improv, because this is so many, we have such a theater kid problem. This is such a theater kid condition that you're describing, where if you're, the thing when you're doing improv, what they'll tell you is that, as with any theatrical thing, as with any even cinematic thing, if you can invoke or if you can exhibit like a raw emotion, it justifies any insane, stupid thing you're doing and point of view,
Yeah.
basically. So in improv, it's all about finding like a weird and funny point of view that you're going to play up, and to make a scene out of, right? And so if you have no justification for what crazy, stupid thing you did in your little improv scene, as you grasp for a point of view in an improv scene, and you do something stupid, and you have no idea why you did it, and it's funnier if you have a good bad explanation for why you do something. It makes it all the funnier. When in doubt, just start crying or just start emoting, and
Yeah,
it immediately
yeah.
it immediately kind of justifies your existence just by emoting, and this is also the ultimate mode of feminine manipulation. Women can cry on a dime. Feminized men can cry and kind of force you to accommodate them because that level of emoting is tyrannical. It sucks all the air out of the room the moment truth doesn't matter, reality doesn't matter. All that matters
Yeah.
is, let's deal with your emotion right now. So there is this connection, I feel, between the theater kid kind of epidemic, and what you're describing, and it's like dark. It's like kind of like black magic. I mean, it's something that people have picked up through mimesis as well as through literal training in the case of theater kids, but mostly through mimesis. They picked it up and they practice it all the time. And it's something that's obviously come from therapy as well. I mean, the more we are instructed to centralize our emotions and our feelings, and largely because that's what we're moved to do to begin with. We're supposed to keep them in check. We're supposed to have dignity. We're supposed to have self-respect. We're supposed to do things that kind of restrict our emotional output into the world so as not to overwhelm other people. But those restrictions have been lifted, and you're like when you the common form of tyrannical power accumulation of our day is to do something grossly selfish, but with an emotional justification. And the more kind of louder you are with your emotion, and the more supposedly vulnerable it is, the more supposedly either vulnerable or empathic it is, the more right you must be. It's an inversion of the importance of emotional reality. It's like we know that emotions are everything, essentially, that we are emotional creatures. Our emotions decide things that our minds rationalize after the fact. And so we learn how to manipulate that power and to let ourselves off the moral hook, and to let ourselves off the hook of consequence of what our actual ideas or what our actual convictions are causing.
It's also the way that what I would characterize as kind of like regimes of feeling, right? And this is, I think, what boys and men in particular are subjected to, and something like adolescence is an example of, right? Is the particular way in which male emotion is policed today, or is kind of disciplined, right? Is in a kind of solicitous way, right? It's always a solicitation of a performance of feelings, right? You're asked to like demonstrate and perform these displays of emotionality to kind of assure other people of your kind of I guess your like self-regulation or your like emotional literacy, but you're never ever granted any kind of authority over this, right? So the decision in terms of how much you'd like to share with other people is never yours. You're never the one who can decide what is and isn't appropriate to feel or express in a given situation. That authority is always located in the sort of, in terms of like media representations, it's always located in the figure of like the emotionally literate woman who is always like rolling her eyes or something. Or in adolescence, it's a bit more kind of tasteful than that. It's like a kind of glum social worker woman who sits across the table from you. It isn't this thing anymore where you're not allowed to cry or something. It's like you're supposed to be able to cry on command. You're supposed to be able to like produce some kind of evidence of your emotional life on command. And this is actually something which I think you correctly identify runs counter to the values of dignity. I feel like we're in a time that's very hostile towards dignity.
It feels like the concept is evaporated almost entirely.
Yeah.
And I get it. Like dignity is lonesome. I understand the problem. The lonelier we are, the more willing we are to dispense with our dignity because we get desperate. And dignity is not going to prevent you from killing yourself. Dignity is not going to prevent you from suffering. You're willing to sell out your dignity before other things, and it's not like dignity is the highest value by any stretch, but it's just It's just like dignity is a mode of respect and self-respect.
It's a pro-social value.
It's a yeah, exactly. It's a pro-social value, and it's a matter of not wanting to make your problems other people's problems. That's part of it, which is just honorable behavior. Honor, another word which
Yeah.
is as Erich. I mean, honor is a word that Erich Auerbach could have a lot of fun with, because he talks about basically how it's the operating value in the courtly romance and in the kind of adventures of the Middle Ages and of the knights and so on, and the noblemen. It's like honor is everything in these stories. It is the entire point of the plot. It is entirely what people are tested with, and the entire measure of a man is honor. That's completely gone. Honor doesn't even exist. It hasn't for decades. It's not like a recent thing.
Yeah.
It hasn't existed for decades. It's just not. It's not a thing. And it's like this. There are these. The reason that we're talking about, we're mourning the loss of dignity and of honor, is not that they are the whole story. I mean, they are these concepts that arise through particular social structures. There's a war between the truth of your feelings in the moment and the objective truth of reality in the world. There's some sort of, I'm not very articulate about this right now, but understand, to bring it down to the kind of, to close on Erich Auerbach himself. He writes this book which makes the case, which I will read now some lines of, which makes the case, so powerfully, that so much of our reality, all of it, is basically rooted in the Christian testimonies of the New Testament, as well as the Old, but also the New. And to be specific, like, he tells the story of, he fixates on the story of Peter, as told by Mark, although it doesn't matter which side you choose. He just chooses Mark. He said there isn't really a big difference. I'm going to read a lot here, but I think it's worth it, because Peter is no mere accessory figure serving as illustratio, like the soldiers, Vibellinus and Persinius, who are represented as mere scoundrels and swindlers in antique literature. He is the image of man in the highest and deepest and most tragic sense. Of course, this mingling of styles is not dictated by an artistic purpose. On the contrary, it was rooted from the beginning in the character of Jewish Christian literature. It was graphically and harshly dramatized through God's incarnation in a human being of the humblest social station, through his existence on earth amid humble, everyday people and conditions, and through his passion, which, judged by earthly standards, was ignominious. And it naturally came to have, in view of the wide diffusion and strong effect of that literature in later ages, a most decisive bearing upon man's conception of the tragic and the sublime. Peter, whose personal account may be assumed to have been the basis of the story, was a fisherman from Galilee, of humblest background and humblest education. The other participants in the night scene in the court of the high priest's palace are servant girls and soldiers. From the humdrum existence of his daily life, Peter is called to the most tremendous role. Here, like everything else to do with Jesus' arrest, his appearance on the stage, viewed in the world historical continuity of the Roman Empire, is nothing but a provincial incident, an insignificant local occurrence noted by none but those directly involved. Yet how tremendous it is, viewed in relation to the life of a fisherman from the Sea of Galilee normally lives, and what enormous pendulation is going on in him. He has left his home and his work. He has followed his master to Jerusalem. He has been the first to recognize him as the Messiah. When the catastrophe came, he was more courageous than the others. Not only was he among those who tried to resist, But even when the miracle which he had doubtless expected failed to occur, he once again attempted to follow Jesus as he had followed him before. It is but an attempt, half-hearted and timid, motivated perhaps by a confused hope that the miracle by which the Messiah would crush his enemies might still take place. But since his attempt to follow Jesus is a half-hearted, doubt-ridden venture, furtive and full of fear, he falls deeper than all the others, who at least had no occasion to deny Jesus explicitly. Because his faith was deep, but not deep enough, the worst happened to him that can happen to one whom faith had inspired but a short time before. He trembles for his miserable life. And it is entirely credible that this terrifying inner experience should have brought about another swing of the pendulum, this time in the opposite direction and far stronger. Despair and remorse, following his desperate failure, prepared him for the visions which contributed decisively to the constitution of Christianity. It is only through this experience that the significance of Christ's coming and passion is revealed to him. A tragic figure from such a background, a hero of such weakness, who yet derives the highest force from his very weakness, such a to and fro of the pendulum, is incompatible with the sublime style of classical antique literature. But the nature and the scene of the conflict also fall entirely outside the domain of classical antiquity. Viewed superficially, the thing is a police action and its consequences. It takes place entirely among everyday men and women of the common people. Anything of the sort could be thought of in antique terms only as farce or comedy. Yet why is it neither of these? Why does it arouse in us the most serious and most significant sympathy? Because it portrays something which neither the poets nor the historians of antiquity ever set out to portray: the birth of a spiritual movement in the depths of the common people, from within the everyday occurrences of contemporary life, which thus assumes an importance it could never have assumed in antique literature. What we witness is the awakening of, quote, a new heart and a new spirit. All this applies not only to Peter's denial, but also to every other occurrence which is related in the New Testament. Every one of them is concerned with the same question, the same conflict with which every human being is basically confronted, and which therefore remains infinite and eternally pending. It sets man's whole world astir, whereas the entanglements of fate and passion which Greco-Roman antiquity knows always directly concern simply the individual, the one person involved in them. It is only by virtue of the most general relations, that is, by virtue of the fact that we too are human beings, and thus are subject to fate and passion, that we experience fear and pity. But Peter and the other characters in the New Testament are caught in a universal movement of the depths, which at first remains almost entirely below the surface, and only very gradually the Acts of the Apostles show the beginnings of this development, emerges into the foreground of history, but which even now, from the beginning, lays claim to being limitless and direct concern of everybody, and which absorbs all merely personal conflicts into itself. What we see here is a world which on the one hand is entirely real, average, identifiable as to place, time, and circumstances, but which on the other hand is shaken in its very foundations, is transforming and renewing itself before our eyes. For the New Testament authors who are their contemporaries, these occurrences on the plane of everyday life assume the importance of world revolutionary events, as later on they will for everyone. They reveal their identity as a movement, a historically active dynamism, through the fact that time and again the impact of Jesus' teachings, personality, and fate upon this and that individual is described, while the aims upon which the movement is centered can as yet be neither clearly grasped nor expressed. It is, after all, one of its essential characteristics that it does not lend itself to simple definitions and explanations. Its effects are already described in numerous examples of its driving dynamism, its surging hither and thither among the people, something which is pure fact no Greek or Roman writer would ever have thought of treating in incomparably elaborate detail.
You have a beautiful voice for his prose.
For the that's good. I'm glad that I can live up to it. I'm losing where I wanted to conclude this reading, but because he keeps going on with such Oh,
No, it's also good.
it's also good. It's also good. I have the quote, one of the the one of the upshot quotes in my highlights. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. Da, 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 da. Whatever kind of movement it may be, which the New Testament writings introduced into phenomenal observation, the essential point is this: the deep subsurface layers, which were static for the observers of classical antiquity, began to move. And this is the moving of mountains, uh, you know, come to pass, come to be fulfilled. And I find it especially instructive, that this is being written by a man who has been driven out of his home country of Germany by the Nazis and is in basically exile at the University of Istanbul during World War II. He wrote this during the Holocaust I think he wrote it between 42 and 45. And this is what he has written. And this is kind of his, you can look at it from that perspective as like a cry to the heavens to not allow the Western literary consciousness to be destroyed, which is to say our entire concept of who we are and of how we can express ourselves in the fullness of God's reality. So, any final thoughts?
No, just thank you for assigning this text, because it kind of it's really lovely to and really exciting to have such a kind of challenge, to have something to really kind of sink your teeth into like this. And I'm really still kind of reeling from the effect of the book, and just it's a very like hard going but extremely rewarding experience. um I guess one of the things that was kind of striking to me as I kept reading was um how often a feature of the text that he's describing, because it's like right there on the surface, it's right there in the sentence structure, the grammar, the specific words used, the specific, and easily overlooked words that connect one sentence to the next, for example. Often the things that he's observing are actually so obvious that if you were looking for a profound meaning to extract, they're the first things that you would overlook, but they are actually the first things that he focuses in on and treats with kind of utmost importance. And he's actually, what he is able to do with that observation is profound. And to tie this in a humble way with what we all do, um, when I think about, uh, the sort of tutelage of, my fellow podcasters, I think, um, what, something that I've been taught by all of you, and have carried on into my own project, has been to always begin with the surface of things, and to begin with basic and simple observations about what is kind of directly and empirically in front of you, right? And when I look at the sort of like vulgarity of like dirtbag leftist slash YouTube essayist media analysis, it is always the assumption that there is something more profound kind of lurking somewhere behind the surface, right? And this is why, they have tremendous difficulty when there is, like, for instance, a morally ambiguous character in a movie or TV show who is portrayed by a handsome, charismatic actor, and this causes all kinds of confusion and consternation because people, respond positively to images of the charismatic actor looking handsome, and then the dirtbag left YouTube essayist people go, "Oh, you've missed the point. You're not supposed to identify with him, or whatever." And it's like, No, this is very deliberately constructed. They cast a handsome, charismatic actor for a reason. This isn't a mistake, you know. Um, yeah, sort of connect what we all do in a very humble way to Erich Auerbach. I take it as a kind of validation of my own method and of our respective methods, that he too begins with kind of the surface and takes the surface seriously.
Yeah, I agree with you, and it's a good place to wrap it up with. To wrap it up, that I think that in general, the world, in our case, this audio way of discussing books and ideas and current events, and in our very kind of fractured world that we live in, has been to open it up and to really like embrace and to celebrate and to analyze or critique all of these elements that are denied by the era of denial that we've been living in. We've been living in an era of denial, and not in the cool Greek, not in the cool Egyptian way. So we're not not in the Cleopatra way. We've been living in an era where everything from the most basic facts of biology, the most obvious and surface level motivations of deep and surface level motivations of the humankind have been absolutely denied, and to many other denials. It's not those. That's the obvious one that that's the one that every phony baloney or makes their little post-left career on. The gender stuff. That's easy. That's something that any old person can figure out. But there's a lot of other denials too, and there's a lot of details that have been scrubbed. There's a lot of layers that have been they're sometimes the ones on the very top, the ones that are in a sense the most important, because without them you don't have any reason to go further. And part of definitely a huge part of our project, of you, me, Jack, Anna, Dasha, and everyone else in our sphere, has been to reveal what has been artificially hidden by these layers of politically motivated obfuscation, and also just kind of digitally motivated obfuscation. And that sometimes puts us at odds with our favorite writers of our own antiquity, which would be Pauline, which would be whoever favorite 20th century writer we can name, who would never in a million years talk about the prosthetic penis or whatever on or one of these details that like they would not, that would be beneath. It would not be something that they talk about, because it wouldn't be allowed in that antiquity of cultural criticism to discuss such vulgar details or erotic details, or just generally uncouth details. It's fallen onto us to expand that sense of reality and to permit discussion of as much as we can possibly think of. I mean, there's nothing that, especially behind the paywall, there is nothing that we are unwilling to voice. To voice an awareness of, I should say. So it has been our burden. It's a necessary one, because otherwise there's just been nothing to talk. There's been nothing to express. There's no, as a creator who's not just a critic, such a curtain has been drawn over so much of reality that there's been nothing to express in any field that is true to life, that feels like it's worth expressing. That has any chance to contend with the history of our culture, and to be part of that history in an important way. And so when something like breaks through, like we've been talking about obviously on television, White Lotus, its defining characteristic is how much more reality it's showing than anything else has shown for years and years and years. Like, that's what White Lotus has achieved. It's showing, it's been saying all the quiet parts, a lot of the quiet parts that have been completely denied out loud. And to us, it's like, oh, this is like what we talk about all the time. But to the wider public, they're in this state of like semi-shock and wonder at these basic things that have been denied, the basic facts of life. That
just also showing that like a piece of art can, represent an authentic reaction to something that's going on, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, although inevitably it'll be related to these things, but it's not, it's not a pure like culture war thing. It's also just like a sort of, sincere artistic reaction to reality, to things that are going on.
This episode of Filthy Armenian Adventures was recorded over the air between Hollywood and London, guest starring Yeerk of the Bistro Californium podcast, available on Patreon. This episode was made possible entirely by the reality merchants, sublime singers, and Dantes of the night who subscribe to our show on Patreon to join their elite society and gain access to twice as many adventures, plus exclusive Smoke Break mini-eps, plus access to our next live event, Hive, coming to LA, Austin, NYC, and possibly London in June. Support the show at patreon.com/filthyarmenian. If you have an iPhone, subscribe from your computer browser to avoid their new tax. Thank you for interpreting, and to be continued.